What is it about the heavens that causes man to look up in wonder? Is it the vast blackness of space, a darkness seemingly so impenetrable that all who gaze upon it must feel their own insignificance? Is it the twinkle of distant starlight that holds for us some unspoken promise that we do not fully comprehend, but yearn to believe? Is it the call of the faraway galaxy, too faint to be beheld with the naked eye, that causes us to wonder what else is out there? Why did our ancestors first look up, believing that in the courses of those stars that they could behold the mind of God? And why are we still looking up? Is it the search for the divine? Or are we trying to find our place in some grand design? And will we know the answer when we find it? Welcome, my friends. I'm so glad that you are here. This, for me, is a little bit like going into the past. I've been working on this video for 3 solid weeks. 3 weeks. I've released biblically speaking videos in that time, started a new podcast, Man Up. Thank you to all of you who have checked that out. And yes, we have another episode coming this Friday, so I hope that you'll subscribe to that, listen to it, get some benefit out of that. But this video has been so long in the making because it is, I think, the nucleus of the things that we need to talk about when it comes to evidence for God. Now, last week, I did a discussion on whether or not science could ever disprove God. Today, we're going to flip the script and we're going to talk about evidence for God in the sciences that are produced by people who don't always necessarily believe in God, and some are even antagonistic to the idea of God, and yet their science really points back to Him. And to talk about why we're doing this, I want to express this one thought. There's actually tradition for doing this in the Bible. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the passage in Acts 17 where Paul is in Athens and he's alone. He's separated from his companions because he's been persecuted, and to sort of get away from the persecution and not bring harm on them as they're finishing up the work in the cities that he had been traveling to, he skips ahead to Athens, and he's there by himself for several weeks, and he's been teaching in the marketplaces and the synagogues, teaching Jews and Gentiles alike about the resurrection of Jesus. And as the word of this gospel that Paul is teaching begins to spread, the men of the city who have a lot of intellectual curiosity, that they like to debate science and philosophy, religion, they want him to come and speak to what is probably a council of people called the Areopagus on a kind of a natural amphitheater called Mars Hill. Now, Paul is willing to do that, but the sermon that he teaches there is probably not what they're expecting. Acts 17, verse 22 says, "So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you.'" Now, we're going to come back to Acts 17 a few times over the next few weeks because it's germane to sort of the exit arc for this series on evidence that we've been doing. But I want you to see what Paul did there. He went and he took their object of worship, their object of consideration, the thing they were trying to get their head around and understand, and he presented through that the evidence that he perceived of God for them to understand. What he did at Mars Hill is what we're going to attempt to do today. It all begins with a cup of coffee. Imagine, if you will, that you and a friend have agreed to meet for morning coffee. He texts you and says, "Hey, I'm running late." So you take out your Bible and you begin to read from the book of Genesis, the story of creation. Every time the door opens, you look up, but he's not yet arrived. The shop is pleasant enough, full of smiling employees and the sounds of morning commuters engaged in pleasant conversations awaiting their drinks. The espresso machine is humming on the counter, and the air is filled with the smell of rich coffee brewing. It isn't long before your barista sets your cup in front of you. You thank her and look down at the drink that she's presented, a latte of exquisite skill. You can't help but notice that she seems to be lingering, reading from the Bible page in front of you. It isn't long before she says, "Can I ask you a question?" You see that the morning rush is beginning to die down, and you gesture that you would love to entertain her question. And so she tells you that she used to believe in God. She read her Bible, prayed, and worshiped with her parents. But then she went to college, and a professor told her that science has all but disproved God. And she began to question, is that true? I don't really feel like my faith is as strong as it once was. Why do you believe in God? And why do you read the Bible? She asks. Hasn't science all but disproven God? How do you answer her question? First of all, I would say that is a great question. I am glad that our young people are being challenged to answer these kinds of questions, because in them is not the destruction of their faith, but if we can teach them how to navigate them, it can be the firming of their faith. Now, an example of that would be Alan Sandage. Now, if you don't know who Alan Sandage is, he was a winner of the Crafoord Prize, which is the closest that you can get to the Nobel Prize in astronomy. He was the heir apparent to Edwin Hubble. If you know the Hubble telescope, Edwin Hubble is the person who noticed the redshift in stars that definitively proved we live in an expanding universe. Now, Alan Sandage started out as an atheist, but I want you to understand that he didn't stay there, because the evidence that he saw in the universe pointed him in a different direction. Take a look at this quote. "It was my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science. It is only through the supernatural that I can understand the mystery of existence." Now, it's important to realize that Sandage is not out by himself on some intellectual island where he's trying to find harmony between God and science. In fact, he's standing shoulder to shoulder with some of the greatest scientists of all times: Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, Johannes Kepler, or, as I like to call them, the fathers of modern physics, chemistry, and cosmology. These men all believed, as you're going to see in a series of quotes in just a second, that their work pointed definitively toward God. It is the perfection of God's work that they are all done with the greatest simplicity. He is the God of order and not confusion. Therefore, they that would understand the frame of the world must endeavor to reduce their knowledge to all possible simplicity. If the omniscient author of nature knew that the study of his works tends to make man disbelieve his being, he would not have given so many invitations to study and contemplate nature. Since geometry is co-eternal with the divine mind, before the birth of all things, God himself served as his own model in creating the world, and he has, with his own image, reached down to humanity. God, in the beginning, formed matter in solid, massy, hard, impenetrable, movable particles, of such size and with such properties, and in such proportions of space that most conduced to the end for which he formed them. God would not have made the universe as it is unless he intended us to understand it. From a knowledge of his work, we shall know him. Nature always looks out for the preservation of the universe. The chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. No being exists or can exist which is not related to space in some way. God is everywhere. Created minds are somewhere. And body is in the space that it occupies. And whatever is neither everywhere nor anywhere does not exist. And hence it follows that space is an effect arising from the first existence of being, because when any being is postulated, space is postulated.
My greatest desire is that I may perceive the God whom I find everywhere in the external world, in like manner, also within and inside myself. God himself was too kind to remain idle, and began to play the game of signatures, signing his very likeness unto the world. Therefore, I chance to think that all nature and the graceful sky are symbolized in the art of geometria.
Even modern intellectuals like Stephen Meyer with his Return of the God Hypothesis or Signature in the Cell, books that I heartily recommend, stand shoulder to shoulder with him, proclaiming that in the heavens we see the evidence of God. Because without God, what we see in science actually makes very little sense. Or, as Nobel laureate Arno Penzias once said,
"The best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted, had I nothing to go on, but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, the Bible as a whole."
So, is science contrary to the Bible? No, actually it points directly to the Bible. Nothing that we see in science contradicts what we see in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, there's a conversation there on how to interpret the evidence, and we'll get to that in the next question. But I want you to see that everything that God created, he created it as good. And that implies design. And all of these men across history, and many others that stand beside them, are still seeing design today. Where we see signs of intelligence, there must be an intellect behind it. And we shouldn't be afraid to see the evidence of that intellect, because it's the better explanation for what we continue to observe, even through the science that supposedly disproves it.
As the young woman considers your answer, life in the coffee shop continues. Drinks are being made, tables are being bussed, the occasional cup is dropped and broken. The young couple across from you has taken an interest in your conversation and has begun to discuss it themselves. When at last, the man leans forward with an air of indignation and asks, "If God is your answer, then how do you explain the age of the universe? There's ample evidence to prove that our universe is more than a few thousand years old. Cosmic background radiation, cosmological expansion, even black holes and dark matter and dark energy are proof that there is more at work than just God. How do you answer him?"
I would say this is also a great question. There's a lot of coffee in this episode, and I've been asked, what kind of coffee do I drink? Well, it is a Texas coffee called Jet Fuel by Independence Coffee. I'll put a link to it in the description because it is a great cup of coffee. But this is an interesting question because the ideas of the Big Bang are something that Christians have for a long time run very far away from. We've been diametrically opposed to it, and I wonder if that maybe hasn't failed us in some aspects. Now, I say this, and I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm saying. I fully concur and wholeheartedly believe with what I read in Genesis 1. If God can create a tree that on day 1 is capable of bearing fruit, if he can create animals that are capable of reproducing on day 1, if he can create a full-grown man, and from that man create a full-grown woman, God can create a universe in a fully mature state. But just like everything else in creation, nothing God creates points itself to the miraculous. That we don't see the miraculous hand of God every day intervening in our world, even though providentially he likely does intervene in our lives every day. But we don't see the miraculous. What we see is order that God has set in motion. And if we follow the evidence of that order all the way back to the beginning, it would appear that our universe is an expanding universe, and that's the type of universe that God created. That's not to say that the Big Bang actually happened. Well, why would God do that? Well, for one simple reason. Many intellectuals that were trying to advance science beyond any realm or any need for religion and faith were proposing types of universes that were called static universes, or said another way, the universe is eternal and has always been here. That was what Einstein favored when he was coming up with his first cosmological constant equation that led to things like general and special relativity. But what we see is that really doesn't fit the evidence that God has put into the universe. Another proposal was that the universe was expanding and contracting. Again, we don't see that. What we see is an expansionary force in the universe, that something is causing the universe to spread outwardly. And that actually fits with things that we read in the Bible. Now, again, that doesn't mean that there is a literal point of singularity origin in the universe, because God created a mature universe capable of sustaining life. But the evidence is that our universe is expanding, and here's why that is important. An expanding universe has a beginning. And a universe that has a beginning means there was something before energy and matter, because energy and matter are within the singularity. They are not yet created before the Big Bang. So what set it off? This is why science has wrestled with this for decades, if not close to a century now. Let me introduce you to a man by the name of Edwin Hubble. Edwin Hubble was a scientist in the early 20th century. He was a contemporary of men like Albert Einstein, and it was Hubble and the work of some of his contemporaries that has definitively shown us that we live in an expanding universe, that objects in the universe are moving away from each other at a steady rate, and even give the appearance of gaining momentum. Now, why this is significant is because if gravity is the primary force in the universe, then the universe ought to be contracting. In fact, life should have never begun in the universe if it all dialed down to gravity. But such is the fine-tuning of the universe with things that we barely even understand, like dark matter and dark energy, that create this balancing act that we have a universe that is expanding even under the force of gravity. Now, why this is significant is because men of the early 20th century really wanted to believe in an eternal universe, in an infinite universe. In fact, Einstein's first cosmological constant took that presupposition, something that he called one of his greatest mistakes or errors of his lifetime, was refusing to acknowledge an expanding universe. And it wasn't until a fellow scientist and a friend of Einstein's, Lemaitre, got into a taxi cab with him and began to talk about the work that Hubble was doing in California. And it wasn't until Einstein went and saw it himself that he was willing to rewrite the cosmological constant to acknowledge expansion. Now, why should Christians know that we live in an expanding universe? Because an expanding universe has an origin. So whether we're talking about cosmic background radiation, or we're talking about the cosmological constant, or we're talking about the things that regulate the expansion of the universe that we don't fully understand, things like black holes and dark matter, what we see is the type of universe that has a beginning. And even when you mix in things like quantum mechanics and you consider the work of John Polkinghorne, who himself moved from atheism to theism, you end up with the need and the necessity of a creator, because something that has a beginning has to be preceded by something else. I want you to consider another quote by Arno Penzias, and this time by another scientist, George Smoot. Now, George Smoot is not a Christian apologist. I don't believe he's an atheist. Last time I checked, he was agnostic. But I want you to consider what George Smoot says about the kind of universe that we live in.
Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. There is no doubt that a parallel exists between the Big Bang as an event and the Christian notion of creation from nothing.
So I want to end this section on this note. We need to get a little more comfortable with the idea of the Big Bang. Not that there literally was a Big Bang, but that science and what it's revealing represents the best model for the universe that God created. And that type of universe points undeniably toward a creator.
As you conclude your answer, the sights, sounds, and smells of the coffee house return in full force. The young barista has had to return to her job because it's still morning rush hour, but seems to be following the conversation from across the room. You'd completely missed the fact that your friend had joined you with an open Bible and seems to be tracking the conversation with some amusement. He's even had time for his own exquisitely crafted latte to arrive. It's then that the man across from you, who's been considering your answer, leans forward with one final question. "Okay," he says, "what then is your best evidence for God?" How do you answer?
So in that third question, what we see is that the people that want to disagree with the biblical explanation for the origin of our universe are wanting to put the shoe on the other foot. That having illustrated that their own science demonstrates the need for a creator, then often the question that's put to us is, okay, well, what evidence is there for God? Just about out of coffee. The evidence for God is an interesting question because it's literally all over the fields of science, whether we're talking about chemistry, biology, cosmology, and physics. It's literally over all of the scientific disciplines. God has left his signature in so many places that we are just ignorant if we don't see it. Now, I'm going to go into more quotes in just a moment, but there's two ideas I want you to get familiar with. One is contingency. Contingency asks the question, why is our universe the way that it is? I mean, if this universe is all time and chance, and you begin to think about how big that chance really is, what you begin to see is that chance is beyond the realm of even possible. Forget probable. It's beyond the realm of possible. One of the things that you really have to get settled on very quickly is that you have to look at the totality of the universe. I can't just take the chance of biological proteins forming from RNA in a primordial soup and amino acids in a primordial soup. And I can't just take the chance that somehow, against all probability, lighter elements would combine in the heart of stars through a three-phase nuclear reaction and become heavier elements like carbon-12 that everything's made out of. That's chance. And if you look at the chance, and while it is happening, the chance that it would happen alongside all of these other events that are happening to sustain life points us to something that we call the Goldilocks Universe. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a future episode. I don't want to get too deep into that right now. But one of the things that Polkinghorne, who again is the father of modern quantum physics, has stated is that our universe is fine-tuned for life. Even guys like Fred Hoyle, who I believe is was a devout atheist, said that when you look at the basic physics of the universe, there's no denying that some super intellect has monkeyed with the physics of the universe. Well, why? Because when you start to stack all of these things that have to happen on top of each other, you end up not in the realm of science when you start arguing for chance, but you end up in the realm of philosophy. There's a couple of different scientific persuasions, I guess, that are out there that have all been put to rest, even though they're still sort of depended upon by a number of people today. They're called the weak and the strong anthropic principle. The weak anthropic principle basically says because I observe it, it had to happen. The strong anthropic principle is kind of the multiverse theory that, given enough time, given enough circumstances, this exact universe was going to happen. The problem with that is that neither of those fits with chance. And the second one doesn't really fit with what we observe with conservation of energy and conservation of matter. So at the end of the day, what we're left with is a universe that isn't explained by anything natural. In fact, it is the supernatural, as Alan Sandage would mention, that is ultimately the story of our universe. And we see the idea of contingency over and over again. But not only do we see contingency, what we also see is the idea of intelligibility, which is to say the universe can be understood by intelligent beings because it was created by an intelligent being. And once we understand that, then we begin to have the kind of conversation. And really, it's a man like William Dembski who really puts this into perspective. Now, Dembski is one of the guys that Stephen Meyer writes about in his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. Imagine that you're traveling through South Dakota and you come across Mount Rushmore without seeing any of the parking lots or anything like that. It's just there. Would you ever assume that that happened by natural causes? I mean, it is fathomable to say that wind and rain could erode rock, but would you ever say that given enough time, given enough opportunity, that Mount Rushmore would create itself out of the naturalistic or materialistic causes that we see in our universe? And no one would argue for that. In fact, we would argue vehemently against it. Well, why? Because we perceive in that monument the marks of design. We see the force that shaped the rock with the rocks down below Mount Rushmore that were cut away from the mountain face. We see the planning of design, and not only the planning of design that we see human faces, but human faces that we recognize. No one would argue that Mount Rushmore was a naturally occurring event. So when we consider that our universe is finely tuned for life, when we consider that contingency tells us that there is an intellect behind this that is speaking to us, then we need to pay attention.
When you realize that the laws of nature must be incredibly fine-tuned to produce the universe we see, that conspires to plant the idea that the universe did not just happen, but that there must be a purpose behind it.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, even people like Bill Gates, who I think is an agnostic, maybe even probably an atheist, I don't really know that he's ever spoken on that. Certainly people like Richard Dawkins that are devout atheists are expressing the need for something more than just chance. Well, why? Well, because complexity is there. And that is undeniable. Even in the most ardent of atheists, complexity in the human DNA, complexity in our universe, and the order that we not just perceive, but that actually exists, points to something other than just chance. And men like Crick, who discovered DNA, and men like Dawkins can offer solutions like Panspermia, which basically that aliens shipped life here or deliberately planted life here. They can argue for that all they want to, but that really kicks the can down the road, because if those aliens are living inside our universe, then what we would behold in them is another question. Where'd they come from? How'd they seed life here? Where'd the intellect come from? It doesn't answer anything. It just sort of makes the problem more complex, which is the opposite of what science is supposed to do. And so when you stop and you consider that any of those beings that are proposed would also have to change the laws of electromagnetism, the force of weak and strong nuclear attraction, gravity, because all of those things have to be fine-tuned in order to sustain life and modern chemistry and to keep the universe from collapsing in on itself or going up like a bang, then how did that become so fine-tuned? That's what we see in the evidence. Once you move beyond that, then you begin to have to say, why would I doubt this? That if there's evidence for design, as Dembski put it, if there is evidence of intelligence, if there is evidence of complexity and order, then what's the reason for denying that those things exist? Is it scientific or is it philosophical? I want to leave you with this thought. We're going to talk about the Goldilocks Universe. We're going to talk about DNA. And then I think we're probably going to wrap up this series on evidences. It takes a lot to produce them, but I hope you've gotten something out of it. As always, I've got a couple of videos for you to check out. One on questions we should be asking, and one on what happened to the dinosaurs. Because that's just a fun one. But as always, I want to say this. Thank you for being here. Have a good day. And God bless.